And it's going to inform our discussion quite deeply, because I don't think that we have that kind of language in our vocabulary when we discuss gender relations. Veronica Aragón is a member of the Faculty of Law, as you've heard. She was also the organizer of this event. Prior to joining the UWI, she was the Deputy Director of the Loyola Law School International Human Rights Clinic, where she supervised clinic students in litigation and advocacy before diverse bodies such as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, CEDAW, the HRC, and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. As a generalist, human rights issues included gender-based discrimination, due process, extrajudicial executions, torture, and crimes of past dictatorships, access to information, and involved a variety of countries, including Jamaica, Ecuador, the United States, and Guatemala. Prior to that, even before, Veronica worked at the Center for Justice and International Law, where she was engaged in litigation primarily on discrimination in nationality rights in the Dominican Republic, but also violence against women in Venezuela and extrajudicial executions in Colombia. I know, extrajudicial. But a serious issue. Veronica.
Can I stay here too?
Please do. Again, 10 minutes.
I'm actually going to shift focus a little now and speak on some of the international standards, specifically some of the international case law on violence against women, and what kind of implications that has for state action and state obligations domestically. I do want to say that while recognizing that there is a clear and broad mandate as far as state action goes, that I do believe that there is not enough of a discourse within international human rights mechanisms on this hegemonic masculinity. And so I believe that therefore there's a disconnect between these standards and what is actually happening on the ground. So there has been significant advancement in legal standards on violence against women since approximately the mid-80s, early 90s, with the entry into force of the CEDAW Convention, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, that's a UN treaty, and then the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women, otherwise more shortly known as the Convention of Belém do Pará. And actually, in the English-speaking Caribbean, there is universal ratification of both the CEDAW Convention and the Convention of Belém do Pará. The question, though, is what does that mean? So what does it mean to eradicate violence against women? What kind of concrete action is required to eradicate violence against women? Maybe part of the answer is fairly obvious, right? We enact legislation prohibiting violence against women, prohibiting discrimination against women. We create remedies, local remedies to address violence against women and discrimination against women. We abolish existing laws that constitute violence or discrimination against women. And in fact, many countries have enacted such legislation. So here in Trinidad, there's the Equal Opportunity Act. There are provisions that criminalize some of the egregious forms of violence against women, such as rape, sexual exploitation, human trafficking. There's also, as Gaietry will be speaking to, there's also the Domestic Violence Act. Yet, when looking at international standards, I believe that there's two major areas of disconnect when we look at these international standards and then we look at what's happening on the ground. And the first has to do really with the language of the legislation itself and the extent to which these standards have actually been implemented in the language itself of the legislation. And so maybe to a certain extent, Gaietry will speak to that. The other part of it is the extent to which these standards have been implemented in practice. Yeah? So, to back up just a little, I wanted to point out that the CEDAW Convention, this is the UN Convention, it actually has zero mention of the words violence against women. Yeah? It speaks to discrimination against women. And subsequently, the committee, in one of its general recommendations, which is it's a document that there's regularly, they make general recommendations that help interpret the treaties that they were mandated to oversee. So General Recommendation 19 expressly ties violence against women to discrimination against women. Yeah? The Convention of Belém do Pará, it actually expressly in the convention itself speaks to violence against women and discrimination against women as being fundamentally linked. So ultimately, the point is that international treaties, international instruments have in fact recognized that violence against women is a manifestation of and part result of discrimination against women. So accordingly, in addition to what I mentioned before, the CEDAW Convention, for example, talks about legislation and abolishing discriminatory legislation, etc. There's another key obligation that's also visible in the CEDAW Convention and the Convention of Belém do Pará. And that one speaks to eradicating discrimination, and not just eradicating discrimination in terms of official documents and official state action, but actually eliminating and eradicating discrimination in terms of the societal patterns of conduct and practice that we see out there in society. So really quickly, to speak to the language, it says, to take all appropriate measures to modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct of men and women, with a view to achieving the elimination of prejudices and customary and all other practices which are based on the idea of the inferiority or superiority of either of the sexes or on stereotype roles of men and women. So this provision really speaks to these deep-rooted societal norms, yes? I don't believe that there has been sufficient government attention put on eradicating discrimination in society. And I do in fact believe that it is precisely this problem of not having addressed discrimination sufficiently that results in this disconnect. Yeah? So I wanted to give a couple examples of some international case law. I'm not going to go into too much. I wanted to take a couple, actually one landmark case in the Inter-American Commission on violence against women, specifically domestic violence. And that's the case of Jessica Linehan versus the United States. I'm also going to briefly mention another case that I worked on while I was at CEHIL, the Center for Justice and International Law. It's a case that is currently before the Commission, Linda Loaiza versus Venezuela. So hopefully you're not familiar with this, and hopefully this is new. So the Jessica Linehan case, Jessica Linehan was a woman living in Colorado who, in the United States, who arrived home one night to find 3 of her children missing. She had previously had a restraining order put against her husband, who was in a very unstable mental state. She immediately knew that her husband had kidnapped the children, and she immediately called the police. And the police didn't do anything. And she continued to call the police, and they continued to tell her not to worry, not enough time had gone by, and that they couldn't, in fact, ascertain that it was her husband. After 7 hours, she showed up at the police station and demanded that they find her daughters. They agreed to do it, and when she left, the detective on duty went to dinner. 2 hours later, her husband had shown up at the police station with the daughters shot in the trunk of the car. Eventually, there was a shootout, and he was killed as well. The Linda Loaiza case is a case of a woman. When she was 18 years old, she was kidnapped, beaten, raped, dragged around the city of Caracas for 2 weeks. That means people saw her bloodied and bruised in the car. That means one of the hotel rooms where she was beaten and bloodied and raped the hotel workers cleaned those sheets. That means the 2 other apartments that she was dragged to, neighbors heard the screams. They heard the pounding on the doors and the walls, and no one did anything. Her sister on 6 separate occasions went to the police to try to file a complaint, and they refused. Yeah? So these cases are the most egregious cases, are some of the most egregious cases. And there's plenty examples. I know there's examples here in Trinidad, right? There's a woman who went raped and naked into the police station and was denied assistance until she went to go put some clothes on. Yeah? So these cases, they happen everywhere. But these are the most egregious, and we can only imagine what the everyday forms of violence against women that occur constantly. Yeah? 1 in 3, right? That was a statistic we heard. So we have case after case highlighting not only the failure of first responders, but the failure of the judicial systems to address this, right? And the failure of us as citizens, as people, as human beings to address what's happening next door or down the street, yeah? And so we have this culture of impunity, right? We have this culture of impunity, it just goes on and on. And I will say that this is not just about women. Yes, it's today's title is Violence Against Women, but this is about violence generally, right? We spoke about boys, we spoke about men. There are men victims of intimate partner violence, etc. Yeah? But so these decisions, what I want to point to is these decisions, these cases, they have very clearly identified that the reason why, the cause, yes, the cause of this kind of violence and the cause of this impunity, this culture of impunity, is our failure to address the underlying deep-rooted social and cultural patterns. And I have to finish. All right. So what I wanted to say, I'll skip my piece on what international decisions say. What I wanted to say is that I actually believe that there is not enough discourse on this hegemonic masculinity and hegemonic femininity within these international decisions. And so the part of the disconnect between what is kind of mandated broadly according to international standards and what's happening on the ground is that these cultural patterns are so deeply rooted that they inform the very attempt to implement these patterns. And so what's needed is to have a bit more of this discussion in these cases to actually begin to develop more what it means, what it practically means on the ground to implement these kind of broad general standards. I'm ending.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.